now we have to go back to the Z layer and implement the creation of the antelope. So here we have to call the facade by calling this facade, and here it would be antelope facade, antelope mapper. We would call this antelope facade, and then instead of get antelope collection, we're gonna call create antelope by passing an antelope transfer that we still don't have. All right, but this antelope transfer has to be populated with the data that we have here in Antelope's backend attribute transfer. So it means that we can just call here, if we do it inline from array, and then we can call Antelope's backend attributes transfer to array. So we don't have this method in the facade, so we can just take advantage of PHP Storm and click add method. And you can see the method here in the Antelope interface, and then we can implement this method in the facade. You can see here that now we have an error because we have to add the new method. And we do the same thing here. So we have here the get factory, create Antelope reader, get Antelope collection. We have to do the same thing here. We just return get factory, create AntelopeWriter. We already have the reader. We have to implement the AntelopeWriter, create AntelopeWriter. And then inside the create AntelopeWriter, inside that class, we're going to call the create Antelope method. So we don't have those methods. We don't have the writer. So we have to implement all of this stuff. So let's just click add method. And you can see that we have the create AntelopeWriter. So here we have to return AntelopeWriter that we don't have. And you can see here that for the Antelope reader, we pass the repository, okay? For the writer, we have to pass get EntityManager because the EntityManager is in charge of creating, updating, and deleting entities. And we have access to the EntityManager automatically when we're inside the business factory. And we can type hint also here as AntelopeWriter interface that we have to create. So we create this interface inside the writer folder. So we create the folder writer. We also have the namespace. We click OK. We change here for interface. And we're going to add the method create Antelope. And we're going to receive an Antelope transfer. And we're going to also return an Antelope transfer. All right, now we can go back to the factory. And we should create the class now. Now we can just right click here in the interface. We can go to generate to refactor and we can extract a class out of it. Or we can just use copy class. We change here the name AntelopeWriter and we remove the interface. Let's just rename it just to match name and name of the class. And as you can see here in the AntelopeWriter, we have to pass the EntityManager. So we can type hint here in the class, in the constructor, we can inject protected EntityManager interface. And here we implement the interface. And here it's time just to call this EntityManager create Antelope. And we pass the Antelope transfer. Of course, we don't have this method here. We have to add the method. We have to change the EntityManager interface for the Antelope EntityManager interface, okay? So here we have to type in with Antelope EntityManager interface. And you can see that in the persistence layer, we have the Antelope repository, but we don't have the Antelope EntityManager yet. So we go step by step, and then we see that we need to create this Antelope EntityManager because it gets automatically injected by Spryker. But we have to create it. You can see here that we don't have the EntityManager. Okay, so we have to go to the persistence layer and create it. Okay, let's create this interface. And we have to create this interface inside Antelope persistence. Okay, we change here instead of class interface. And then we define the create Antelope. That it's going to receive also Antelope transfer. And it's going to return an Antelope transfer also. All right, now it's time to implement this method. So we're going to create also a class out of it. Now we have the EntityManager ready and we have to implement now the Antelope's creation. So how can we create an Antelope in this method? Well, we can create an instance of the entity. So Antelope entity new PYZ Antelope. Then we can populate that entity by calling from array, and we get the Antelope transfer, and we call to array. Then we call the save method, and after that we return the Antelope transfer, but we populate it with the new properties that we can have from the entity. Okay, we call then the other way around. We call from array, and then we cast the Antelope entity to array. But if you remember, we have the mapper here inside Propel Mapper, and we can map an Antelope transfer to Antelope entity. So we can call this method here. We have both map Antelope transfer to entity, and we also have from entity to transfer. So let's use the mapper inside the Antelope EntityManager. So we can create a method here, a protected function, create Antelope mapper. That is going to return an Antelope mapper interface, and we return new Antelope mapper. So here we can call this create Antelope mapper, then we can call map Antelope transfer to Antelope entity, and here in entity in Antelope we pass new PYZ Antelope, and we would have the mapping automatically done by the mapper. Then when we save the Antelope entity, we can return this create Antelope mapper map the other way around, Antelope entity to Antelope transfer, and then we can pass the Antelope entity, and we can pass the same transfer. Okay, you can see that we can use the mapper in order to map from an entity to a transfer, and from a transfer to an entity.